What a warm welcome. Thank you very much. And not least of the warmth in my heart is from hearing myself praised and honored and thanked by a publisher of a mainstream media publication, Der Spiegel. I don't recall hearing that in my country from any such person, or from an attorney general like Gerhard Baum, the Minister of the Interior. Perhaps that day will come, but meanwhile, it has definitely been worth traveling 9 time zones to come and hear that from such people, and I appreciate it. I apologize for not speaking German at all, unlike all the Americans up on the movie there, but fortunately I have a translator here. I especially then want to thank Heidrun Hanisch, who herself traveled 9 time zones to California to encourage me to come for the Friends of Dresden observation, and also, of course, for the Klaus Schiffer Foundation, which has brought me here. Let me ask, though, if I may, how many people here can understand my English? Could I see? Quite a few. And how many do not, honestly? You wouldn't know. Can't answer that. Go ahead. Okay. It's especially an honor, the honor above all of this occasion for me is to be in the company of such earlier recipients as the greatest statesman of the last century, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Stanislav Petrov, to whom we owe our presence here. Had he not acted as he did with the initiative and moral courage, civil courage that he showed, every city in the Northern Hemisphere would have suffered the fate of Dresden. It's very moving for me as an American, 10 years old at Pearl Harbor, 8 years old on September 1st, 1939, 14 at the end of the war. So someone who grew up during the Second World War, watching newsreels of the Second World War, to be honored in Germany. I was brought up during those years to believe by the propagandists of my country that in an ironic sense, a good German was peculiarly someone who thought obeying orders of authorities was the absolute highest value, and not only obligated total obedience, but excused total obedience no matter what was demanded. Of course, the 70 years since 1945, and I'm now 84, has taught me and many other people that that was quite false, that trait of total obedience to orders, silence when one's authorities demanded silence, was not at all peculiar to Germans and not at all missing from my own country. In fact, as an American in the Pentagon, in the State Department, in Vietnam, in the Marine Corps, I myself participated in that hierarchical order in which it was taken for granted that there was no higher loyalty than one's loyalty to the president or to the orders of your superiors. That was a fatal belief, as it proved for the Germans in the 30s. As I've said, I myself participated for many years, far too long, in that same bureaucratic ethos, ethics. And on the other hand, my life does show that change is possible. I changed. And your presence here today in Germany, as Germans, and in recent years, in years since the war, all since the war, has shown that nations can change, that Germany has changed. And I congratulate you for it, and it's an inspiring example. In honoring me, you are obviously also honoring my wife, Patricia. I love seeing her in that movie, My Beautiful Wife. And Tony Russo, and all those, my children, and all those who helped me copy and distribute the papers. And also all those who inspired me in the first place. Americans who said no to a draft, to the requirement of going to a war that they knew was not only hopeless but wrong, and who risked and actually went to prison. 5,000 Americans went to prison to say as strongly as they could that this was a war that one was not permitted morally to participate in, as they understood it. And of course, I found I understood it the same way, and they alone put in my head the question, what can I do now to help end this war now that I'm ready to go to prison? Of course, when I say that your presence here and your applause shows attitudes with which I greatly sympathize among Germans, I'm well aware that that doesn't apply to all Germans any more than to all Americans. I'm under no illusions. First of all, nations may change, cultures change. Bureaucracy does not change very much. Intelligence services do not change very much, if at all. I don't believe that Snowden, my friend Ed Snowden, will ever be able to go back to America, because I don't think that any president, no matter how sympathetic he or she might be to Ed Snowden, could bring herself or himself to defy the intelligence agency's desire for revenge against Snowden for revealing their own unconstitutional and criminal behavior. And I believe much the same would be true in this country, despite the widespread sympathy for Snowden among the public. I heard Jakob Augstein make a reference to a German linguistic peculiarity of which I was first made aware in 2003 when I came to Berlin and got an award from the German Federation of Scientists for whistleblowing, a whistleblowing award. And I was given that by someone who's here today, Justice Dieseroth, and some other judges. And before I was introduced, I asked Judge Dieseroth to tell me, as someone who didn't speak German, what is the German word for whistleblowing? And he said to me, as Jacob Augstein said, there is no German word for whistleblowing. And now tonight, when I before this, when I mentioned this to him, he told me for the first time, well, there is a German word that he either remembered or he hadn't told me at the time, Alarmschlager. But at that night, I asked him, when he said there is no German word, I asked him, well, what is the closest word you can think of? And he said, Verräter. And he translated that for me. And I said, is there perhaps another word? And he said, yes, Petzer. And I said, well, so I said, well, it's like that in my country too, pretty much. And really in every country in the world, especially in the view of the officials. Now that is a very high price that a whistleblower has to pay. In my experience, and I've met very many of them now, I've made it my business to meet people that I feel such sympathy with and really such identification with. And I found a couple of things. For one, they are, like myself, more than usually patriotic. They have very high ideals for our country and are acting on the basis of those ideals. And to be called a traitor, as they all are, is very painful. You never really get used to it. And I've heard it recently, after 40 years. You keep hearing it. But there are other costs as well. The loss of clearance, the loss of access, the loss of self-importance, as someone who works for the president. The loss of your job, your career, very often your marriage. I was fortunate that that did not happen in my case. And in recent times, under Obama, prison. So the penalties for telling a truth that your colleagues do not want told because it's embarrassing or criminal or reckless or controversial, unpopular, the penalties for that are very large. Thank you. And yet, the effects can be very great. As I have only recently learned, and I was telling Jakob Augstein just now, he himself was unaware of it, that the Spiegel affair of 1962 was an almost exact rehearsal or precursor to the Pentagon Papers affair of 9 years later. I won't go through all the details. It's quite amazing to me, quite striking. But I'll mention two. One, that in my case, of course, the crimes and lies that were told about me to shut me up led to the downfall of the president who would otherwise have continued the war for several years. An effect, in other words, greater than I could have hoped for, really. And in the case of Der Spiegel, the source to Der Spiegel of the Follex 62 exercise results led to the downfall of Franz Josef Strauss, the defense minister, because of his lies and crimes against the newspaper. It's a rather startling resemblance in these two cases. Finally, let me mention three things that occur to me from the whistleblowers that I have met, including Chelsea Manning, whom I've only communicated with. No journalist has been allowed, no one has been allowed to speak to her since she was arrested 6 years ago. But I've also been in much communication with Ed Snowden and regard him as a close friend now, and also Julian Assange in his quasi-detention now in London. First, not one of them counted on having any great effect. They hoped that their revelations might help. That was true of me, that was true of all the others. To think that you're guaranteed to the kind of results that Der Spiegel affair did achieve and the Pentagon Papers affair did achieve would be foolish, and these people are not fools and did not expect that. Second, nearly all of them have paid a much greater price than I did. That was for not greater than Nixon intended for me, but greater than I actually experienced because of extraordinary phenomena in my case. Yet, not one of them that I've talked to some of whom have spent years in prison, regrets what they did. They understand that even if it had no clear-cut effect, as was true of Mordecai Vanunu in Israel, who spent 11 years, something like that, I think 8.5 in solitary confinement for revealing the large nuclear capability of Israel, has never regretted what he did, even though it had no perceptible effect on anyone's policy. And there's a third point in the end that I will say in a moment. Go ahead. The last point is, however, that these people are not without regret in every case. Far from feeling that they are righteous in a way that other people are not, I found that everyone, and that includes me, does regret that they did not do what they did not tell the truths that they could have told earlier and more clearly, more forcefully. So I was very struck when one of these, actually in this case, a conscientious objector who had been 2 tours in Iraq, was one of the very first to report on torture, and therefore refused to go back to Iraq and went to prison instead. Camilo Mejia wrote in prison a piece which he sent, which had a poem in it by a German, which made a very powerful effect on it. It spoke to me, and I found that it speaks to every whistleblower that I have met. It's by Albrecht Haushofer, the son of the geopolitician who helped inspire Hitler to the notion of Lebensraum and move to the east, but who later saw through the Nazi regime and was suspected of encouraging Hess to try to go to England, to try to end the war. But in any case, Albrecht, who was a professor of geopolitics and in the Foreign Service, and had written a number of plays, was arrested for having been part of the group that was trying to shorten the war in the only way that it could have been shortened. Not by bombing, not by invasion in terms of a quick end, only by overthrowing Hitler. And he was part of that effort as a courier. He was arrested. Eventually, he was in Mohabit prison, was taken out to a field by SS officers 2 weeks before the end of the war and shot in a field next to Mohabit. His brother found him in a frozen field in an overcoat with his hand inside the overcoat, and inside his hand, his dead hand, were 90 sonnets that he had written in Mohabit prison. I want to read that, even though my German is nothing, because it is a sonnet, and I think it has more effect. Let me just ask one thing. How many people here know the story and the sonnet that I've just described? No? I don't see any hands. Is that possible? Okay, I see one. Okay, go ahead. Thank you. Again, you must forgive my German, my non-German. I leave off for brevity the first few lines, which I recommend you look up, where he says, I bear lightly what the death sentence that the court has sentenced him for, indicted him for. He says, I would have been guilty had I not done what I did for the future of my people. So he doesn't feel guilty for what he did do. And these are the words, as I say, that I think every whistleblower known to me identifies with. Doch schuldig bin ich anders, als ihr denkt. Ich müsste früher mein Pflicht erkennen. Ich musste schärfer Unheil nennen. Mein Urteil habe ich viel zu lang gelenkt. Ich klage mich in meinen Herzen an. Ich habe mein Gewissen lang betrogen. Ich habe mein Gewissen lang betrogen. Ich habe mich selbst und andere belogen. Ich kannte früh das Jammers ganze Bahn. Ich hab gewarnt, nicht hart genug und klar. Und heute weiß ich, was ich schuldig war. That is why what I say to people who hear me in the States, potential whistleblowers, officials, people who are now participating in the terrible wars that have been conducted recently. And let me take one moment and characterize those. As I say, I am well aware of the city I am speaking in now. We all know why your beautiful city is so new, so young, having risen from ashes, like Shanghai, Guernica, Rotterdam, Warsaw, London, Coventry, Darmstadt, Hamburg, Kassel, Dresden, and later Tokyo, Nagoya, 64 other cities, all subject to unjust means in war, to basically a crime against humanity. That has not stopped. In Vietnam, the town of Binh Tre was described by a American major during the Tet Offensive. We had to destroy the town to save it. I've been reading in the last week what has happened to the town of Ramadi in Iraq, and not for the first time, and elsewhere. I could say, looking back on my life, that one theme characterizes my activism in the government and outside, and that is to try to spare other cities from that massacre from the air. In fact, I copied the Pentagon Papers in '69 because of a very specific belief that under President Nixon, Hanoi was likely to suffer that fate. I did not succeed in preventing that. The war did not end without Hanoi having been destroyed by B-52s, though the war was shortened. That is certainly a sense of failure on my part. So I do have a last word, which, go ahead. So I accept the honor that you've shown me here very gratefully, in the same spirit that you give it, that you, like me, want to see more whistleblowers. I believe had there been an Ed Snowden or a Chelsea Manning at high levels in the Pentagon or the White House or the CIA in 2002, there would not have been an Iraq war. So my message on every occasion that I'm offered like this to an audience or to potential whistleblowers is this: don't do what I did. Don't wait till bombs are falling or a wrongful war is underway and almost impossible to stop. Do what I wish I had done years earlier in 1964 or earlier by going to the newspapers, Der Spiegel, the Times, or to WikiLeaks, and to Congress also, but not only to Congress. Without the press, they are unlikely to act. And tell your truth. The cost, if you're identified, will be very great. And yet, as I've said, the stakes are very high. A war's worth of lives may be saved.